Good evening, everyone. If you don't mind taking a seat, we'll get started. Good evening. If you don't know me, I'm Beth Allen, and I'm the Deputy Director and Curator here at Morven, and I am pleased to welcome you to the fourth and final program in the 2025 Grand Homes and Gardens series, The Quality of Doing Mid-Century Modern Grand Homes and Gardens. This has been Morven's most successful Grand Homes and Gardens series to date, and we can't think of a better way of ending it than with tonight's program. And shout out to Greer and her committee who thought of mid-century modern, which has truly filled every single one. Yes. In 1945, Arts and Architecture magazine commissioned major architects to study, design, and build efficient and affordable model homes. The resulting case study houses were concentrated in the Los Angeles area and featured the work of architects and designers such as Richard Neutra, Charles and Ray Eames, and Eero Saarinen, among many others. Tonight, we will explore some of the most celebrated experimental and influential case study houses. As many of you know, on January 7th, 2025, wildfires erupted in the Los Angeles metro area and raced through multiple neighborhoods, killing more than 24 people and razing upwards of 15,000 homes and businesses. With some of the homes tonight being part of those communities most affected by the fires, we wanted to acknowledge this, and we'll send some links along with the program recording for ways you can still help those displaced. The 2025 Grand Homes and Gardens series would not be possible without the support of some amazing sponsors. And I'd like to invite one of them to come up and say a few words before I introduce tonight's speaker. At this time, I would like to invite Brian Taylor, our 2025 series sponsor from the Bryn Mawr Trust, to share some words.
Thank you, everyone. I'll keep this brief because I'm really looking excited for the case study houses program. But thank you so much for joining us on the final evening of the Morven Grand Home and Garden series. On behalf of Bryn Mawr Trust, it has been an absolute pleasure to sponsor this year's series, celebrating the timeless beauty and innovation of mid-century modern homes. We are so fortunate to have been aligned with Morven, an institution that values legacy, preservation, and the beauty of well-planned estates, both financially and architecturally. It's a perfect partnership rooted in heritage, vision, and long-term impact. At Bryn Mawr Trust, we've been a part of the communities we serve for over 135 years, and this series really has reminded us why we love this Prince community so much. It's about the connection to each other, to the stories that shape us, and to the spaces that give us joy. I'd like to wish a heartfelt thank you to Rhonda, Beth, Megan, Greer, and the entire staff at Morven for letting us be a part of their commitment to celebrating architectural excellence, including the sleek lines and visionary design of mid-century modern homes. Whether you're an architect, which I think we have a few in the room here today, a preservationist, a design enthusiast, or simply someone who appreciates beautiful spaces, I hope that this year's series deepen your appreciation for the remarkable era of design. Please enjoy tonight's program, and once again, thank you for allowing Bryn Mawr Trust to be a part of the 2025 Grand Home and Gardens Speaker Series. Thank you.
Before I introduce our speaker, I have a few final housekeeping notes. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the talk. My colleague Greer will rove around with the microphone for questions. Please use the microphone so those online can hear you. For those of us joining us virtually, please drop your questions in the chat and we'll read them aloud for our speaker. So finally, and also a recording of this program will be shared with all registrants via email a few days following the event. Okay, now finally. Elizabeth Smith joined the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation as its first executive director in 2013. Previously, she held curatorial positions at the Art Gallery of Ontario, Toronto, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, and the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. While at MoCA, Smith curated the exhibition Blueprints for Modern Living, History and Legacy of the Case Study Houses, and authored subsequent publications on the case study houses for Taschen. As well, she curated and co-organized such MoCA exhibitions as The Architecture of R.M. Schindler, At the End of the Century, 100 Years of Architecture, and Urban Revisions, current projects for the public realm. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Smith.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you everybody for coming out this evening. I'm honored to be part of this series. It was exciting for me to hear that there was a series taking place here about mid-century modernism, which is dear to my heart. So I'm really happy to speak with you tonight about the case study houses. As Beth mentioned, I have some history with this project. In that, I curated an exhibition in 1989 at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. And on the screen, you see the cover of the catalog to that exhibition, which is on your left. And then on the right is a subsequent publication that was put out, and I authored the intro on the same topic. So it is something that has, continued to be important to my own work and scholarship. And I'm pleased to share it with you this evening. So while I talk about the case study houses, I also am going to periodically include some slides of the exhibition devoted to case study houses that took place at MoCA in 1989. Because we're in a house museum situation here, I thought it might be interesting for people to see how an exhibition devoted to this moment in mid-century modern architecture was brought to life in an exhibition setting. So on the screen, you're seeing two images of that show. On your left, you see, some conventional sort of artifacts that are presented in architecture exhibitions, namely scale models, drawings, photographs. They're presented in a somewhat interesting way on hanging panels that was meant to evoke a mid-century modern aesthetic. And on the right, you'll see a view into one of the full-scale reconstructions of case study houses that were built as part of the exhibition. And that, I think, was a very interesting aspect of the show because it allowed architecture to really be brought to life within the spaces of the museum. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on and about the particular case study house that was recreated in full scale in the show. But first, let me introduce the founder or the brainchild of the case study house program, and that was John Entenza, the editor of Arts and Architecture magazine. John Entenza is shown in wearing the dark suit coat in the slide on your left, standing together with his good friend and collaborator, Charles Eames. And, these are two of the great powerhouses of mid-century modernism. John Entenza had come from the Midwest to Los Angeles during a little bit before the war, and he spent the war years, doing a variety of different things. He was somebody who had wide-ranging interests, and he was, very open to different kinds of ideas. He was interested in design, he was interested in architecture, he was interested in film, and of course he had an opportunity to sort of be part of all of those spheres of interest in LA at that time. But what he did was to buy an existing magazine called California Arts and Architecture, which was a sort of house and garden variety publication. You see a cover of the early California Arts and Architecture in the slide at right. You see that on the left side of the slide. And then next to it, you see an example of how Entenza transformed the magazine by bringing in some of the most progressive modern designers to really give it a completely new look. And he became part of a community of people that were highly interested in all kinds of progressive modern design, whether it was graphic design, architectural design, furniture design, title design for films. And he was able to sort of parlay this creative community and build a sphere of influence using the magazine as its nexus. So Entenza and the architects with whom he surrounded himself were, well, during the war years, of course, in the Depression, things had really slowed down in terms of the ability to actually build in this country. And there was, really sort of a pent-up demand for for housing and for new building and construction that was imagined, that people knew would be needed in the post-World War II environment. And a lot of the progressive architects of the time in California, as well as throughout the United States, looked to Europe. And they were very influenced by international style modernism, which had been flowering and flourishing there since the 20s and teens, certainly. So some of the examples of things that were important to them included on the right, the Frankfurt kitchen, which was designed in 1925 for housing estates in Frankfurt that were, designed as social housing, apartments basically that were, constructed to house a great many people quite efficiently. And the kitchen itself was a study in rational planning. Everything was created so that there would be the least amount of movement necessary for somebody working in the kitchen to be able to cook and, open a cabinet. And it was really a brilliant example of efficient, scientifically based, technologically inspired design. And of course, the modern architects were very much against the Victorian period with its heavy cluttered, interiors. And so I very much like the poster on the left with the big red X over an image of a Victorian interior, which gives you a clear sense of what it was that they did not want to do. In Southern California, early in the 20th century, a number of architects from Europe had emigrated and begun to practice there. And there was some really very experimental work that was being done. On the right is the house designed by Rudolf Schindler, called the Schindler Chase House, that was designed and built in 1922, which opened up sort of completely through a sliding door to the exterior garden. And it was conceived very much as a place for indoor-outdoor living, and was described sort of as a kind of like a cave and a tent. And Schindler was interested in experimental construction and in working with concrete. So the floors and the walls were made of tilt-up concrete, which was a fairly novel technology at the time, but it had been pioneered even earlier in La Jolla, California, around the turn of the century by the architect Irving Gill. And you see a picture of that on the left. And that's, you're looking at the La Jolla Women's Club, which I think is 1901 or something like that. And you can see the walls being like tilted up into place. So the walls would be poured flat, tilted up. Looking for ways to use new materials to design and build cheaply and efficiently. And then, of course, in the 20s, on the left, is another example of an important modern building in Los Angeles by the architect Richard Neutra, who, like Schindler, had come from Austria to Los Angeles. And Neutra was enamored of the climate in Los Angeles, and that the temperate, the warm air and the healthful living that was possible because people could spend so much time outdoors in that kind of a climate. And his design for the Lovell Health House, as he called it, was realized just about the same year as Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie in France, which is pictured on the right. And you can see very much the similarities, the flat roofs, the geometric proportions, the sort of ribbon windows, all the signature elements of international style modernism. But in LA, there were so many variants cropping up on the modern style. And so Frank Lloyd Wright, for instance, was building in Los Angeles, and Lloyd Wright, his relative, was also building homes. You see a concrete block house on the left by Wright, and on your right, you see a pavilion-like home by the architect Harwell Hamilton Harris, very Japanese in appearance. Sliding panels that opened up to, merge indoors and outdoors were a feature of that design. And so all of these things were flourishing by the time Entenza came up with the idea of the case study house program. In the January 1945 issue of the magazine, when the war was still on at the time, but its end was in sight, he published a an op-ed piece, if you will, announcing the Case Study House program. And you can see the first part of that on the screen. In case it's not easy for you to read what's there, I'm going to just read a couple of the sentences that give you an idea of what his mandate was. He said, "We are proposing to begin immediately the study, planning, actual design, and construction of 8 houses, each to fulfill the specifications of a special living problem in Southern California. 8 nationally known architects chosen not only for their obvious talents, but for their ability to evaluate realistically housing in terms of need, have been commissioned to take a plot of God's green earth and create good living conditions for 8 American families. They will be free to choose or reject, on a merit basis, the products of national manufacturers offering either new or old materials considered best for the purpose by each architect in his attempt to create contemporary dwelling units." So he's, sort of putting out there a mandate, 8 people, 8 designs, 8, American families, and giving each of them free rein to use the kinds of products, construction techniques, and elements that each architect would feel would best contribute to a kind of prototypical modern design for a typical American family. And in Intensa's mind, this was a way to offer something new to the American public following the end of the war. He wanted to influence public opinion in the US to accept modern architecture. It wasn't too well known. And he wanted to offer the building industry models for what could be done that would be different from conventional housing that had been built previously. So it was a bit of a pipe dream, but he was a pragmatist. And with the magazine as his forum, he was able to also interest manufacturers of products and building materials who would be advertising in the magazine to make these items available to the architects building the case study houses. Over the years, so the program began in 1945 and it continued until the early 1960s. Over the years, there were quite a few case study houses built. I think about 26 in total were built around the Los Angeles area, and quite a few additional ones were designed but never built. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I move you through the program. Because what was sort of most challenging after Intensa issued his proclamation and chose his architects to begin designing these homes was the fact that in the immediate post-war years, you couldn't get building materials. It was really, really difficult. Everything had been channeled to wartime production, and it took time for things to become available. So his idea of having, new materials, new products, more technologically based ways to build had to be put on the back burner for a little while. And some of the architects had trouble finding clients and had to come up with hypothetical clients, hoping that somebody would come forward and actually commission them to build their design. This is one of the early case studies designed by the architect J.R. Davidson. And one of the most interesting things, I think, is the section of the living room that you see on your right. And again, I don't know how well you can read any of those notations, but what you might notice is that everything was very carefully planned. It was a study in spatial efficiency and in thinking about what things would the post-war family need and want in their home. And he thought about a sort of a place for everything. And he also thought about the fact that in Los Angeles, in the heart of, the film community, there would be people who would likely want to, screen films at home in their living room. So, he made provisions for that to happen in a small environment like that. And in the kitchen, even, he made space he designated places for salt and pepper shakers, the coffee maker. I mean, he really thought down to the last level of detail, but he did so in a design that was very compact, very modest, characterized primarily by, with the indoor-outdoor quality of its floor plan and by the ability of the rooms to open up to each other and to do away with the kind of formal conventional features of houses in the pre-war period. So the servantless house was something that was, very much thought about and talked about. Unfortunately, Davidson's design was not built. He was able to build another case study later, a few years later, but it was for a different family, different site, and the design was changed. A couple more examples. Oh yeah, so you see there on the left, the how in the kitchen, everything has a place. Every little item is thought about. He had actually done the design of ship interiors in the 1930s. So he was well attuned to the merits of really being efficient and compact and having sort of a compartmentalized zone for everything. You can see that in the ladies of the house's dressing area as he imagined it. But you also see, note his notation about the lighting, in the ceiling, which would have been a very unconventional feature at that time. Another early unbuilt case study was this one, designed by the architect Sumner Spalding, and it was called the Loggia House, because his idea was to create a floor plan that created a number of rooms within a garden. And the building materials he envisioned were adobe brick set within steel frames and punctuated with areas of glass block for illumination. So quite an unusual series of materials, but also his concept for having the rooms either completely open up to the garden when the sliding, panels were open, or enclosed to be more private, was a rather brilliant way to respond to the climate, thinking of some of his predecessors like Schindler, who had also been very interested in devising sort of new approaches to indoor-outdoor living. Another one of the early unbuilt designs, again, these were all designed in 1945 as part of that first wave of case studies, was a home called the Greenbelt House by an architect named Ralph Rapson. And this is a view into the original scale model of the Greenbelt. And this is a perspective drawing that was published in Arts and Architecture magazine showing the exterior of the home. And I think you can get a better sense of what he meant by the Greenbelt, by calling it the Greenbelt House. He envisioned two pavilions with a sort of butterfly roof, bisected by a large greenbelt of planting, so that one side of the house contained the private area, the bedrooms, and then the other side of the house contained all the social spaces, living room, kitchen, etc. And in the middle, the outdoors was really brought inside the house. And his renderings are kind of wonderful because it, sort of shows you how he was imagining these spaces being used. You also may note the presence of a helicopter that is flying above the house. And of course, at that time, people were imagining the fact that, people would commute to work by helicopter. They wouldn't be driving cars anymore. And that was actually, an idea that was fairly popular at the time. This kind of futuristic imagination of what could happen. Ralph Rapson made a number of variants of his concept while he was arriving at the final Greenbelt design, and I thought I would show you a few of them because you can get a sense of how imaginative he was in trying to picture different ways of, making small houses. And he sort of went all over the map here, ranging from a design where a house would be sort of hung on a wall, to something that, on the left, something that ends up, sort of being more of a precursor to what he finally ended up with the Greenbelt. But you see, he was experimenting with the location of the different social spaces and how those might really be rethought and rearranged. Another couple of views of the scale model, which I think shows that Greenbelt really beautifully. And this rendering, I think, is great because we can see how he envisioned the husband and wife, or the man and lady of the house, sort of conversing on one side of the space while a child rides a tricycle around nearby, and another child, I suppose, is tilling the soil there in the vegetable garden at center. So it's really kind of a wonderful and imaginative idea. Unfortunately, it was never built. But in our exhibition at MoCA in 1989, we chose that design to build at full scale because we thought it would be a really interesting exercise in actually allowing people to see what it could have been. So now you're looking at a view into the full-scale model of the home that we presented at LA MoCA. And I have to give a shout out to the amazing architects and designers and people who were involved in the film industry, set dressers, for instance, who worked for Hollywood Films, that helped us create these full-scale models. It was not an easy thing to do because since the house existed only in sort of sketch form, it hadn't been fully thought out. And so our architects and designers for the show had to work with drawings such as the one you see on the left. And from that, they had to visualize what that zone of the house might have been. And I think they did a wonderful job of it. And of course, we went to great lengths to find, the furniture, the period furniture that would have been included in the house had it been built, and that was indicated in some of Rapson's sketches and drawings. So visitors to the exhibition were able to come into the show and then walk through the houses. And in this way, we were also paying homage to John Intense's original plan, which was to open up the case study houses after they were built to the public, to be toured. So it would be like an open house. It would be advertised in the magazine, advertised throughout the city, and it would be a way for people to come and experience what a modern house would be like. And apparently, once they started doing that, they had around 300,000 people that would actually come and, walk through these homes. And it was quite impressive for people. Another view of the Rapson house from the kitchen area, and then looking out into another area of the exhibition. We had a sort of a big illustrated timeline that one could see through that kitchen space. I just want to giving a little bit more context for all this. I also want to point out some related examples of experimental approaches to housing using technological materials that actually were constructed in the immediate post-war period. One of those was Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion house, which is a design that he had done in the 1920s, but that was actually built in Wichita, Kansas, on the left there, in the immediate post-war period. And they were able to actually use materials that had been applied and used in the aircraft industry for that home. And then on the right, you see an image of one of the so-called general panel houses designed by the architect Conrad Wachsmann being assembled. And it sounds, very much the general panel houses. The idea was like a panel system, sort of like a kit of parts that could be easily assembled. And of course, the mandate here was affordability. The idea was that this way, many, many, many houses would be able to be built that would really serve a wide population. And the fervor and the zeal that architects had to experiment and actually realize designs of this type was very strong in this period. Case study houses number 8 and 9, I should mention that they all had a number in the program, were actually two of the most outstanding houses. They were designed for and by Charles and Ray Eames and John Intense. For John Intense, the house was designed by Eero Saarinen. But they were sort of conceived as a pair, which you can see in this particular image. And I'll start with the Eames house. It was first designed by Eero Saarinen and Charles Eames. The two of them together came up with the idea to develop a simple pavilion structure that would extend out from a hillside. They had a specific site, and Charles and Ray Eames served as the client for their own case study. So you can see that early version of the design on the left. By this time, so that 1945, that was the first design. It wasn't actually able to be built until 1949. And, I referenced how difficult it was to actually get materials for a while after the end of the war, particularly things like steel. Because, of course, many of the architects wanted to build in steel, and it just wasn't available for quite a long time. But finally, for the Eames house, the steel was available. The house was intended to be built entirely from off-the-shelf parts, meaning everything was available that was like prefabricated and that was intended for industrial uses, not for residential uses necessarily. And this was a very unusual thing, but they picked everything sort of off the shelf, and it was finally delivered to the site. And then Charles and Ray Eames decided to change the design. They decided that they wanted to have more space enclosed, not just a single-story pavilion, but they wanted a double height home. And they were able to reconfigure using all of the same materials. I think there was only one piece of steel or one element that, didn't get used. And they created a completely different house that you see in the two images on the left. So double height, enclosing much more space. And it was envisioned as a residence for Charles and Ray, who were a married couple. And then connected to it, or just sort of directly behind it, was a studio for the couple, because they also worked together. So it really was, a much more imaginative and adaptable solution to their specific needs. On the right, you see an image from the MoCA exhibition, where we chose to mock up a section of the structure of the Eames house. We didn't do like a full-scale, fully furnished presentation as we did with a couple of the other houses. Instead, the idea was just to show the structure, give people a sense of the elements of steel and how they were joined. And then behind, or just on the other side of the structure, you see some examples of furniture and sculpture designed by Charles and Ray Eames. It was a really nice way to bring those things into conversation. So back to the Eames house itself. The site, I'm sure some of you may have actually visited the Eames house if you've been to LA, and if you haven't, and next time you go there, please try to visit it. It's one of the great, in my opinion, one of the major residences of the 20th century. And it was spared, from the fire that was raging right around it. So that's a wonderful thing. The site itself is very impressive. It's on sort of a meadow. It was sort of overlooking the ocean, but subsequently a lot of trees have grown in. And you can see that the windows were factory sash. So, and that was the kind of industrial aesthetic that they wanted. And they made for, sort of a very beautiful way to separate and unite the indoors and the outdoors. And then on the right there, you see Charles Eames in the studio space. So you can, appreciate the height. You can see that the ceiling is a kind of like decking, steel decking. And then you see, how simple the environment is, but how full it is of all of the many design projects that the Eames were so well known for. Right next door to it was the house for John Entenza that Eero Saarinen designed. And the Eames and the Entenza houses were called, or were sort of known as, technological twins, but architectural opposites. Technological twins because they use the same materials that, off the shelf, steel decking, factory sash, things of that nature. But architecturally, instead of being open and sort of skeletal, like the Eames house was, the Entenza house was more enclosed. It was a single height space. And especially on the interior, the structure was masked by wood paneled walls, carpeting, and it was designed very much to be a space for entertaining because John Intensa, who was a bachelor, needed very little private space, but he loved to have gatherings, he loved to have parties, people were always over at his home, and so you can see there on the left how inviting it must have been to sort of walk down into the kind of conversation pit area there and hang out, have martinis and smoke cigarettes and things of that nature. So the relationship of the two houses was very interesting. And so by this time, 1949, things were actually getting built, but Intensa was serving as the client for his own house, Charles and Ray Eames serving as the client for theirs. It was difficult to find the kinds of clients and people that had been envisioned originally. One of those clients, one of those young families did come forward to be a client for Richard Neutra. And this was a young doctor in his family. And his design for case study number 20, the Stuart Bailey House, is a really wonderful example of how Richard Neutra, who was one of the more senior architects to participate in the program, brought the vocabulary of modernism, with which he had been practicing for quite some time, and he brought it to the service of a very small, very modest, sort of very cost-effective house for a young family, a doctor and his wife, and I think 2 or 3 small children. And over the years, the Baileys asked Neutra to make additions to the house, I think not just once, but 2 or 3 times, as their family grew and as their resources grew. So it was a really wonderful example of Neutra being able to build onto an early design that he had created, for this young family. And here's a view looking from the living room out into the meadow beyond. Neutra is probably best known, not just for the Lovell Health House that I showed you earlier, but for a house like the one on the right called the Kaufman House, which was designed and built in Palm Springs, California. And that was a very elegant, large, much more luxurious house in terms of its materials. And I think what's interesting is that Neutra was able to work in both ways. He was able to design something that, perhaps was quite costly, using like really high-end, high-grade items. And he was able to, design these small, much more reasonable and much sort of scrappier homes for younger patrons and people with less means. Right around the time that these houses are being built, I'm bringing you 2 examples from around 1949, 1950. I think you may have already heard about the house on the left, the Farnsworth House, and then also in Chicago, another work by Mies van der Rohe, the Lakeshore Drive Apartments, right around just a couple of years apart, I think. So just, again, just providing some additional context of what else was going on in the US around this time, but still examples of modern architecture were few and far between in this country. So come 1950, the case study architects are now able to get hold of the materials they want to build the houses that they envision. And they were able to, to build houses like the one you see on the right, designed by Rafael Soriano. You see on the left an image, I think this is one of the ads that was in the magazine that shows the material that was being used in the house. And this was one of the ways that Intensa, was able to get materials donated by advertising them in the magazine. So it was sort of like a win-win situation for people because they would get either donated materials or they would get a significant discount. One of the most elegant architects of the Case Study House program was Craig Elwood, who was actually trained as an engineer and not an architect, but he had really one of the sort of purest approaches to modernism, and his houses are just elegant and beautiful. This view on the right was a shot that I myself took in, it must have been like 1986 or something like that, when I drove around Los Angeles trying to see which of the case study houses were still there, which ones were still intact. And this Elwood case study from the early 50s was one of those. And as you approach the house, you see a screen of translucent plastic, actually, that shields the house from the street. And it's quite elegant and beautiful and provides the kind of privacy needed by the occupants. And then you see in that image on the left how at night, when the house is lit up, it sort of creates this beautiful glow. Elwood had a, sort of a deft touch in terms of how he brought together the steel framing and the panel infill. And he often liked to create walls that didn't go all the way to the ceiling, but were sort of like floating panels within the space. And he had a very sort of interest in flow between exterior and exterior. And you can see that sense of flow, I think, in a beautiful way in terms of how the wood wall of the bedroom here on the right extends from interior to exterior and seems to create a much more expansive space. And then how a little courtyard is created by that translucent glass panel along the back. So these are sort of really very like sensitive touches that open up these small houses and make them appear much more spacious. And then, of course, in the rear, the backyard came equipped with a built-in barbecue and ways for people to gather and in the way people like to do in the 50s and cook out. Another Elwood house, which is sort of equally elegant, this one a bit larger than the one I just showed you. And this one also had a number of interesting materials like mosaic and terrazzo. And you see the color also that's incorporated in areas of the house, which is quite wonderful. And then this was the largest case study that Elwood designed. You can see from the floor plan that it's quite spacious. It was a 4-bedroom house. And, as the 50s went on, as we all know, there was a lot more prosperity. And families were, tended to be larger. And this house appealed to a family that, had 4 children and, liked to entertain around the backyard pool. And everything is very well thought out and very refined, but also very simple. The kitchen spaces of these homes are, interesting for us to observe today because, they're not large like the kitchens that we favor today. They were quite modest and quite compact, as you see in the image on the left. And here on the right is another view into our exhibition where we had a timeline of products, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, things that were relatively new at that time, that were features in these houses and that really made that idea of servantless living a reality in the post-war period. And then, of course, just speaking a little bit further about the design of furniture and objects to be included in these modern homes, that was all very much part and parcel of the architect's aesthetic. And there was wonderful design that was done. One of my favorite teams of designers was called Van Keppel Green, and they were well known for their outdoor furniture that was also used indoors in many of these homes because that, kind of relaxed, low-slung furniture worked well in either context. And the idea was that living was to be informal at that time. And then, of course, there were wonderful planters that were designed by a firm called Architectural Pottery. And then from Arts and Architecture, which was a somewhat rarefied architecture magazine, you then had the Los Angeles Times Home magazine, a much more populist journal, presenting this kind of design on the cover of one of the issues of the magazine. So it was really, becoming much better known. Let me just check my time here. Okay. Another very innovative case study architect was named Pierre Koenig. And he designed 2 case study houses, both of which are very important and interesting. This one is quite small, and it was very severe. If you note both of these views, you'll see that there was no roof overhang. It was quite, the walls, sort of meet the ceiling. And he had sort of different ways to mitigate the impact of heat and sun. He used screens over the sliding glass windows. And he also developed a system that you can probably observe in the image on the right of circulating water, like a pool of circulating water around the perimeter of the house that was pumped up to the roof hydraulically and then fell back down, almost like like little rivulets, as a way to cool the house. And I think you can maybe see some of the water like coming down on the side of that image on the right. So he had a number of, ways to try to mitigate how the house functioned while maintaining his very, rather rigid and severe design sensibility, which was to be, extremely like rectilinear. He loved the contrast of the black steel frame and then the white steel decking, but he also incorporated a good bit of color, as you can see in the shot of the kitchen over there, that kind of lemon yellow of the cabinets and appliances, I think is really quite wonderful. I think that sort of severity in the architecture here is apparent in this particular image. And if you contrast that to the similar bedroom shot I showed you a couple slides ago, designed by Craig Gilwood, I think you could appreciate the difference. There's a lack of, organic elements, no wood paneling here, no sort of graceful enclosure of a patio, but things, sort of meet each other in a tough way. And this house was designed for a childless couple also. So, there wasn't the issue of children falling into the circulating pool and things of that nature. I love this image, which was, staged as a sort of a publicity shot for the houses and shot by the well-known photographer Julius Schulman. The architect Pierre Koenig was actually pulled in to be the man standing there by the hi-fi while a model was used to stand in for his wife. And, she's looking very elegant and glamorous there. But it gives a sense of the kind of lifestyle that was being imagined for and envisioned in these types of houses by the late 50s. So it's straying a little bit from John Entenz's original concept for typical American families. But it sort of pushed these ideas about architecture in new directions. And Pierre Koenig's best known case study house was called the Stahl House. And it's one that you've probably seen many photos of. On the left is my shot of the house, again, back in the late 80s when I went driving around in my beat up little car there that you see a little corner of there in the image, looking for the case studies. And I, saw that house and I realized how shielded it was from the street. But once inside, things were totally different. I'm showing you here first, just a floor plan and a rendering of the house so that you can, again, appreciate the sort of the severity and the simplicity of the plan and the fact that it's very, very rectilinear. It's just an L-shaped idea using very large areas of steel and very large areas of glass. And of course, that was possible by this time. It wouldn't have been possible some years earlier, but Koenig really wanted to push it as much as he could to harness the best technology he could find. And he ended up building a house, and look at the slide on the left first. You can see how it was sited on, a hillside, on a very steep hillside, and it sort of jutted out over the edge of the hill. And it has this incredible panoramic view of Los Angeles that unfolds below it. And at night, that is particularly incredible. In our exhibition, we also recreated this house because there was a high area within the space of the museum. And on the right are images of the recreation based on the original Julius Schulman photographs. It was pretty convincing reconstruction, and people could walk in, and they weren't allowed to sit down on the furniture, but they could walk into the space. And then at top, you'll see that there are a number of video monitors that were situated down below, and those conveyed, interviews and historical footage that put things in context, but they were meant to simulate the twinkling lights of the city below from the original photograph. So again, the designers of our exhibition were really brilliant in how they found ways to bring these ideas to life for our visitors at that time. And then here's another view into our reconstruction in the museum of that house. And you can see the L shape. The bedrooms were grouped along one wing, and then the living space was grouped along the other wing. And there was a large swimming pool. The bedrooms looked out onto the swimming pool. Well, we recreated the swimming pool by using large sheets of plastic, and I think you can kind of see it. If you look in the photo, you can see how the plastic is kind of pulled tight. And otherwise, it looks pretty convincing. You also see the structure of the museum above too, which gives away that it's a reconstruction. But it was really wonderful to be able to showcase these houses in that way. Another really important later case study is this one, which is in the Altadena area of Los Angeles. And now all of you know about Altadena because it was one of the places burned down in the LA fires. However, the area where this house was located was spared, which is wonderful. And it's an absolutely beautiful house. The architects were Buff, Straub, and Hensman. And it's different from many of the other case studies because these architects did not care to use steel. They were not enamored of technology necessarily, but they were enamored of industrial methods of production. And so they chose to use pieces of wood that had been industrially formed. So you can see these curving barrel vaults that they used as part of the roof. These were, this was plywood that was, developed a certain way and treated to be able to be, applied as they did so here. And, everything again was thought about in terms of a panel system and in components that could be put together cheaply and efficiently. And the result, because of their use of these curves, because of their use of wood, the result was sort of much warmer and a bit more organic, which fit much more nicely into the environment there because it's an older area of the city that had many large trees. And it was sort of a graceful and more harmonious relationship to the environment than some of the other case studies. And I particularly like the view on the left where you're looking into the living room area and you see echoed in the curve of the roof, you see a curving large fireplace that, introduces another sculptural element. The clients for this house were a couple named Saul Bass and Dr. Ruth Bass. Saul Bass was a well-known graphic designer who did many titles for films. And his wife, Ruth, was a biochemist. So they were, a professional couple. A model is there, in the kitchen. That's not Dr. Ruth Bass. But the architects were, of course, thinking again of that kind of efficiency and being able to, move quickly and easily in the kitchen and have that access to the living spaces right beyond. Some of the latest case studies, and now I'm drawing to a close here, took somewhat of a different turn. This was a home that was designed in the early 60s. Very spacious, very large. I think it was 5,000 square feet, which is big. It's a big home by today's standards. And the material used here was donated or made possible by a company called Pacific Clay. And so clay brick was the predominant material used. But the design features, the flat roofs, open plan, swimming pool, were prevalent. And then another late case study was built entirely of steel as a kind of demonstration project for Bethlehem Steel up in Northern California. And the architect for this one was David Thorne. And the sort of dramatic curve of the carport area, you can see that it sort of hovers above an area below where the living spaces of the house were all on one floor, and it was situated on a hillside with a very dramatic view. So a lot of change in the case study houses over the years as the economy improved, as materials were more available, as people were sort of demanding more, as modernism was becoming sort of more widespread. There had always been a desire on John Intense's part to have the case studies be replicated around the land, across the land, to have many, many examples of case studies and modern house designs around the country. And that really did not come to pass at all. But I'll show you just a couple of attempts to design and build more than one case study. This was one called the Triad, because there were 3 examples of houses. These were built in La Jolla, California, in quite a spectacular spot overlooking the ocean. The right here shows a view from one of the houses looking up to an adjacent one. And these were made from wood. The wood was painted white. Flat roofs, open plans, all the similar design features, but again, turning to wood instead of steel to create the vocabulary for these 3 houses. A couple other views of this triad, just again to show you the variety of the designs. And then finally, and sadly, an idea for a tract of case study houses, for 200 and some case studies that were to be built in the valley area of LA, above, a bit north of the city. The architect was A. Quincy Jones. And you see on the left a view of the scale model that he made of one of his case study houses, surrounded by mirrors, so that it would appear to there would appear to be many of them, extending around the land. Sadly, this tract was never realized, but he had a number of ingenious ideas about how to build these houses. He chose to excavate below ground and position the houses so that they could be built in close proximity to each other, but they would be shielded from each other. The noise from one to the other would be lessened because they would be, below ground. And as you can see in that little diagram, it would keep the sound from traveling. And the idea also for having them below ground was for heating and cooling, that it would keep them cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And it was an example, today we can look at this as an example of energy efficient design sort of before its time. So it's really a pity that this wasn't built. And sadly, there were no, multiple examples of case studies that were built. After all, instead, as we know, around the U.S., Levittowns proliferated, and conventionally designed and built houses were what was cost efficient, quick, and easy to build, and what the builders and the tradespeople and the developers were familiar with. So, the U.S. became sort of covered in many places with examples of this kind of traditional housing. Yet, outside of the case study program, a number of modern architects in the LA area and elsewhere too were actually able to build multiple examples of modern design. Gregory Ain designed a group of homes that he called the Mar Vista houses in LA that were very case study-like, although they weren't officially part of the program. And then another group of architects designed and built a number of related homes in a hillside area nearby that was called the Mutual Housing Association. And here's a rendering of some of the designs for mutual housing, which shows you how the houses were situated around the hillside, and many were built. I will conclude by telling you that the case study houses were sort of a very sort of specific chapter. The designs were made by architects invited personally by John Intense to participate. So there were many who didn't get asked, simply because maybe Intense didn't like their work so much, or he didn't know them personally well enough, or whatever. It was really a very individual approach that Intense had for bringing people into the program that he, felt excited about and confident in. And consequently, architects like John Lautner, who we now know is, a very famous modern architect who designed the building on the left, the Chemosphere House, among many other buildings in LA. He never participated in the case study program, nor did Albert Fry, another well-known modernist whose very experimental houses were sited mostly in the Palm Springs area. You see one on the right. And architects like R.M. Schindler, who had predated the case study program and who continued to be extremely experimental, extremely attuned to creating low-cost houses. He was never invited to do a case study, nor was Frank Gehry, who was actually a student of some of the case study architects. He was, a younger figure. And here's an early design by Frank Gehry on the right. This house dates from 1958. So that would have been just the time when the Pierre Koenig houses were being built, the Buffstraub and Hensman house was being built. And Frank Gehry learned from these architects, and he took their lessons into his own vocabulary and his own architecture. And he presented us with houses that were, very case study-like. So we can thank the case study architects for what they gave a future generation, and we can applaud their creativity, their ingenuity, their forward-thinking nature. And again, I encourage you, if you go to LA, to seek out the Eames House, seek out the Pierre Koenig Stahl House, which is also open by appointment. And it's really wonderful to be able to visit some of these places. I'm so glad that they've survived. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was fantastic. And I have to say, the exhibit, I'm sad that I didn't get a chance to visit the exhibit. It was beautiful and such creative ideas. So now we have some time for questions. A reminder that we can take questions in the audience, and then I also have my laptop to take questions from those online. Come over to you.
The Intensa House is still there, but I understand that it's been changed quite a bit. Yeah.
Actually, that was one of my questions. So I lived in Los Angeles for a long time, and I had the good fortune of seeing their exhibition, which was wonderful. And after that, I went on a tour to find all the case study houses, and I found that a lot of them had been altered. And I was curious because over the course of time I was in Los Angeles, they became these kind of coveted treasures, and very wealthy people would buy them and restore them meticulously. So I was just wondering about the state of intactness, if that's a word, of the case study houses now.
Well, you're right that many were altered. And, it was when I was going around looking for them, I found a number that were, unrecognizable. They had been filled in, they had been, given sort of Greek and Roman, characteristics. And, it was really strange and sad. Of course, that was the period of postmodernism, like in the 80s, when, a lot of people didn't like that aesthetic at all. And they had, changed things. So back then, even many of the houses were unrecognizable. And then subsequently, it is interesting. I think that there was sort of a revival of interest in mid-century modernism as of the 90s, I guess, and early 2000s. And I do, in LA, I have to say, I credit our exhibition with helping raise attention and awareness. And so many people did become interested in, preserving those houses. Later on, they became quite expensive. And now, I think they're wildly expensive. But there are a few that have been, kept really beautifully and preserved really well. And I think, this is a problem everywhere, right? People are going to make changes to things. Even if something is landmarked, I think it's if it's a private home, it can be changed, and there's little people can do about it. So fortunately, the Eames House is now owned by a foundation, so I think nothing is going to happen there. The Stahl House is being lovingly maintained, by the family. I think they have some kind of a foundation structure that they're getting going, but they also make revenue off of the home because they have film shoots and things like that. So it's just a mixed bag. You won't find, as I guess you learned, you won't find too many of them in pristine condition anymore.
I was struck by as someone who lived in Japan, I was struck by the Japanese influence on those houses. The open plans, the sliding panels that opened up to the garden, and this at a time when Japan was the enemy. So how could you comment on that? That this strong Japanese influence was playing out in these designs, but we were also at war with Japan. I mean, it's kind of intriguing.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think the open plan, as inspired from Japan, sort of came into the modern architectural consciousness much earlier than World War II. I mean, certainly, I'm thinking just about LA and how that, how Frank Lloyd Wright had spent time in Japan and had been very influenced by their planning, and he was, doing work in LA in the teens and 20s. I think there was awareness of Japanese architecture here, and I mean even through the expos, there was evidence of Japanese architecture that was seen and known in this country on the West Coast. I think up in San Francisco, there had been the architecture had been demonstrated. So I don't think you make such an interesting point, and I've never thought about it before, but my sense is that people weren't necessarily associating that kind of open planning with the Japanese and in the context of wartime in the 40s and 50s.
There was an important Japanese community on the west side of Los Angeles.
That's right.
And it's still there. Sawtell, the shameful internment, of course. But
That's right. Very true.
An awareness of it.
Very true. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I mean, the open planning is so interesting because, yes, it's very Japanese. I also think about it, the European examples from early modernism and international style, but of course that too is somewhat indebted to the Japanese examples. So it's quite fascinating how these things sort of transmit and travel around. And of course, at that time, people had, limited ways to get information. So it's even more interesting, I think, to consider how certain aspects of architecture morphed. Yep.
We have a question online here. Did the homes have AC and heat, or can you comment on some of the kind of day-to-day practical elements like that of the homes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say very little in the way of AC, maybe no AC. Heat also was handled quite minimally and simply. Radiant floor heating was quite popular at the time. And, that's like with coils of sort of heated water in a floor. And a cork flooring was often used as well, or like concrete. But the radiant panels would provide, pretty decent heat. But, I think people then were sort of they really were celebrating the fact that it was a temperate climate in LA. Now, in other parts of the country, of course, people had to deal with heating much differently in their examples of modern architecture. And someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that air conditioning didn't become such a big thing in residential architecture until much later. Am I right about that? Yeah, I mean, now it's something people demand, but, it's like the large kitchen, people sort of demand a large kitchen now because it's become the thing that people like to have in their home. But, at one time that wasn't the case. Same with air conditioning, I think.
I happen to have, good fortune of buying a mid-century modern house late in the mid-century. It did have radiant heating in the floor and cork and cement on the floor. I was able to buy it very reasonably, and when I went to sell it, it was very difficult to sell it. I was wondering why, or if you have any comment, why that style never was that popular.
Is the home in this area?
It's in North Township, about 15 miles.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such an interesting question and point. And modernism is something that not everybody loves. My sense is that in Los Angeles, there was and still is a greater, acceptance and appreciation of modernism. It's been sort of become more in the vernacular of building there, and maybe less so in the Midwest and on the East Coast, where I think the majority of people still prefer, a more conventional or traditional house that, speaks to them of home values that they associate with an earlier period. And I think there's a rarefied group of people that really appreciate modern architecture. Perhaps that is why your home, which I'm sure was wonderful, was difficult to sell at the time you chose to sell it. Often, sadly, people will, buy, a small, it probably was modestly sized. They'll buy a small home that they feel is a little bit dated, perhaps. They'll raise it and they'll have something completely new and different designed. And that happens everywhere, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. And I hesitate to ask this in a room filled with architects, but is part of this design matching the landscape of Los Angeles? I mean, the homes were primarily single level. They had limitless space to expand into. They were flat roofs because they don't have the snow and the rain, but maybe, I know architects can design around that, but the rest of us that live in the rest of the country think that's a problem with a flat roof. So I was just wondering, is that part of the design? Do you think, is it a specific area like that, or is it just off the mark?
You mean the reason why there were many more modern homes in the LA area because of the lack of the
time. I mean, I think, people were modern, they were in California, they were looking ahead.
Right. That could very well be. I mean, I think there are, challenges with, snow and the weather conditions that we have in the Midwest and East. And you must have experienced that in your house. I mean, hopefully there were not big issues with that, and that the design was.
It didn't work that well.
The rain didn't work that well, but the snow, the snow factor wasn't an issue, I hope. Okay, all right. Well, in the LA area, they do have plenty of rain. It does rain there quite a bit. So, yeah. But perhaps, I should actually defer to one of the architects in the room, maybe to respond to that question. Because I don't exactly know precisely what one does to mitigate against those weather conditions on a flat roof. I know there are ways to handle it.
Thank you for the great talk. I'm curious about, did you present one of the Craig Elwood houses that was just recently torn down by Chris Pratt and his wife to live next to the mother-in-law? Was it one of the ones that you presented?
I don't think so. I think that I think I know the one that you're talking about, and it's not one of the case studies. It was another Craig Elwood design. I'm quite sure. That's not to say I'm sad that one was torn down as well, but it wasn't actually part of that specific program.
I just wanted to add to the question about modernism in New Jersey and comment that one of our leading mid-century modern architects was actually a woman by the name of Eleanor Pedersen, who was based in North Jersey, and I believe she designed Nixon's home in Upper Saddle River. But when I applied to architecture school in 1977, I'd never met an architect before, and a friend of a friend owned one of her homes. So I got to visit it. And sadly, it has fallen into hard times. I recently went up and tried to find it again. But she was the first president of New Jersey AIA, woman president of New Jersey AIA, I believe. So look her up. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad to know about her. I wasn't familiar with her, so that's great to be informed.
Any questions? Oh, come there.
About steel, does that age well, or is it like these sculptures that, it has to be refinished and it will corrode and rust, and it's not stainless steel?
Well, I think steel is pretty solid and pretty hardy, and it would have been coated, treated, painted. I'm sure that there has to be some kind of upkeep over the years.
But it's not an issue.
I don't think so. And again, if there's an architect in the room that knows more than I do about this, please speak up. But I think steel is pretty, a pretty good material for
Long life.
For a long life. Yeah.
What about the glass? Was that thick, some kind of thick glass that they put in? I think it was single pane back in those days. They didn't have
Yeah. Yes,
glass is a problem, I think. I lived in a glassy house once, and
Okay.
not only did it kill birds, but it,
Yeah, that's right. That's right, for the birds. But these architects worshipped large areas of glass. I mean, that was part of the whole aesthetic, being able to have that, that view out, or open that wall up and just, be one with the outdoors. So they were enamored of glass, and as sheets of glass became larger and larger, the technology of the glass, evolved. Like Pierre Koenig in his, his case studies, he just, was so enthusiastic about being able to use the largest sheets of glass that were available. And it's pretty dramatic. It makes for a pretty dramatic environment, for sure. Yeah, but not good for the birds.
I actually have one final question for you. I was thinking about during your presentation. Do you have a favorite case study house?
Do I have a favorite? Well, I guess, I mean, to me, the Eames house is so special because it's so innovative in its architecture, but yet it's so poetic and it's so unique. And the way the Eameses furnished it just made it into a completely unusual and unique environment that only they could have done. And I just think it's marvelous. So, there's really nothing like it. And I have to say, I'm also maybe a little bit prejudiced, because when I was doing research for the show, Ray Eames was still alive, and I was able to go there, and she served me breakfast in her home, and these beautiful little bowls, it was just like a magical experience being with her in her home, having breakfast, looking out at that beautiful meadow, having her, talk to me about everything there. And I just was, I found it such a meaningful experience. So I think that's my favorite.
That's a good one. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful talk, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. I again can't think of a better way to end what's been a really great series, and I'm excited to go out to LA and visit the Eames house now. So thank you all for being such a great audience throughout this whole series. I also want to thank Bryn Mawr Trust for being such an amazing series sponsor and supporting this so we can make it all possible. So have a wonderful night, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Elizabeth, again.